There are survival stories that seem impossible. Then there is the story of Ernest Shackleton. Imagine watching your ship become trapped in solid ice, knowing that every day the freezing Antarctic Ocean is squeezing it harder. There is no rescue coming, no radio to call for help, just endless white wilderness stretching farther than the eye can see. For most people, this would have been the end. For Shackleton, it became the beginning of one of the greatest survival journeys in human history.
Welcome to Last Stand Stories, where ordinary people face extraordinary odds, and every decision could mean the difference between life and death.
In 1914, Europe was entering the First World War. At the same time, British explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton was preparing for a very different battle. His dream was to achieve the first land crossing of Antarctica, a journey no human had ever completed.
His expedition ship was named Endurance, inspired by his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." It sounded inspiring. Soon, it would become a desperate promise. The crew of 28 men sailed from South Georgia Island in December 1914, heading toward the frozen coast of Antarctica. Spirits were high. The men joked together, cared for dozens of sled dogs, and believed they were about to make history. But Antarctica follows its own rules. As Endurance pushed deeper into the Weddell Sea, the floating ice grew thicker with every mile. Giant sheets of sea ice surrounded the ship, leaving only narrow channels of water. Progress slowed to a crawl. Then, on January 18, 1915, everything stopped. The ice closed around the ship like a giant frozen trap. The crew waited, believing warmer weather would eventually free them. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Instead of releasing its grip, the Antarctic ice carried Endurance farther away from its destination. The ship was no longer sailing. It was drifting wherever the frozen sea decided to take it. The men quickly realized they weren't leading the expedition anymore.
Nature was. Months passed, and the frozen ocean refused to let go. The crew settled into a strange new routine. They cared for the sled dogs, hunted seals and penguins when possible, repaired equipment, and tried to stay busy. Every task mattered, because boredom could become as dangerous as the cold itself. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Powerful winds swept across the endless ice. Some days, the silence was overwhelming. On others, the ice groaned with deep, thunder-like sounds that echoed beneath their feet. Shackleton watched everything closely. He knew survival wasn't only about food or shelter. It depended on morale. He encouraged games, shared meals with the crew, and made sure everyone had a purpose. Small routines gave the men something to hold on to when hope seemed distant. Then the pressure began to build. The pack ice shifted with incredible force, pressing against Endurance from every direction.
The ship's massive wooden hull creaked under the strain. Every crack echoed like a warning. In October 1915, the pressure became unstoppable. The ice crushed the ship piece by piece. Heavy timbers bent, beams snapped, and freezing seawater rushed inside. Pumps could no longer keep up. The crew fought to save their home,
But the Antarctic had already won. Shackleton gave the order no captain ever wants to give. Abandon ship. The men stepped onto the frozen sea, carrying only what they could pull by hand. Behind them, Endurance slowly disappeared beneath the ice, taking with it nearly all hope of completing the expedition. Their mission was over. Their fight to stay alive had just begun. Now, 28 men stood on a drifting sheet of Antarctic ice, with no ship, no nearby civilization, and hundreds of miles separating them from the closest possible rescue. From that moment forward, every decision Shackleton made would determine whether anyone ever saw home again.
With Endurance gone, the ice became their only home. The crew pitched tents on the frozen surface and built a rough camp using supplies they had managed to save. Food was carefully rationed. Every biscuit, every piece of meat, and every drop of fuel could mean the difference between life and death. Shackleton faced an impossible choice. Should they march across the unstable ice, or wait for it to drift closer to open water? The ice was constantly breaking apart, opening deep cracks without warning. Pulling heavy lifeboats across that jagged landscape exhausted the men. After days of brutal effort, they had covered only a few miles. Shackleton called off the march. Wasting precious energy could cost lives. So, they waited. For months, their camp drifted north with the moving pack ice. They hunted seals and penguins whenever they could, melted snow for drinking water, and endured blizzards that battered their tents day and night. Despite the growing uncertainty, Shackleton stayed calm. He spoke with confidence, shared the same hardships as every crew member, and never allowed despair to take control. Then, in April 1916, the frozen world around them began to break apart. Large cracks spread through the ice, and sections of the camp started drifting away. Remaining there was no longer an option. The men hurried to launch the 3 small lifeboats into the icy Southern Ocean. Towering waves crashed over the boats. Freezing spray soaked their clothes. Every hour brought another battle against the wind, the cold, and exhaustion. After nearly a week at sea, they finally reached the rocky shores of Elephant Island. It was the first solid ground they had stood on in almost 500 days. But there was one devastating problem. Elephant Island was uninhabited, far from normal shipping routes, and no one in the world knew they were there. They were safe from the ice, but rescue was still painfully out of reach. Shackleton knew waiting on Elephant Island would end in disaster. No ships sailed this remote corner of Antarctica. If they stayed, rescue might never come. There was only one chance. He chose 5 volunteers and prepared the strongest lifeboat, the James Caird. Their destination was South Georgia Island, home to a whaling station nearly 800 miles away, across one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean on Earth. On April 24, 1916, the small boat pushed into the freezing sea. Towering waves lifted them like a leaf before crashing them into deep valleys of water. Hurricane-force winds, freezing spray, and constant storms threatened to flip the boat at any moment. Ice formed on the hull, adding dangerous weight. The crew hacked it away with whatever tools they could use. For 16 exhausting days, they battled the Southern Ocean with almost no margin for error. Navigation depended on brief glimpses of the sun through storm clouds. One mistake
could send them hopelessly off course. Against incredible odds, they reached South Georgia. But the journey still wasn't over. The tiny boat landed on the island's uninhabited southern coast, separated from the whaling station by towering mountains, glaciers, and terrain that no one had ever crossed. Without maps or established routes, Shackleton and two companions set out on foot. They climbed icy ridges, crossed dangerous snowfields,
and pushed through nearly 36 hours without sleep. Every step brought them closer to the only place where help might exist. Then, at last, they spotted the whaling station. The exhausted explorers walked into civilization looking almost unrecognizable. Shackleton had survived the impossible. Now, he faced one final mission. He had to return for every man waiting on Elephant Island. Reaching the whaling station was only half the battle. Shackleton refused to celebrate while his crew remained stranded on Elephant Island. He organized a rescue attempt as quickly as possible. The first ship was stopped by thick pack ice. The second couldn't break through. The third was forced to turn back. Each failure meant more weeks of waiting for the 22 men left behind. Still, Shackleton never gave up. On August 30th, 1916, more than 4 months after leaving Elephant Island, a rescue ship finally found a path through the ice. As the vessel approached the shore, Shackleton searched the beach with one question on his mind. "Are you all well?" A familiar voice answered from the island. "All safe. All well." Every single member of the Endurance expedition had survived. Not one man had been left behind. The original dream of crossing Antarctica had failed, but something even greater had been achieved. In one of the harshest environments on Earth, Shackleton's courage, determination, and leadership kept 28 people alive against overwhelming odds. More than a century later, his expedition is still studied by explorers, military leaders, and businesses as one of history's greatest examples of leading through crisis. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't reaching your destination. It's bringing everyone home. If you enjoyed this true survival story, subscribe to Last Stand Stories, because the next story could be even more incredible. Until next time, stay strong and never lose hope.